All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for sticking around to the last session of today's conference. This is session 3, which is broadly focused on diversity and its intersection with environmental economics and producer choices affecting the environment. So in this session, we're going to have 3 presenters, and I think we have a slide highlighting our presenters. So we'll have Wesley Zebrowski, Aparna Howlader, and Tong Wang, each presenting their research papers. Each presenter will have around 20 minutes to present, and then we'll be happy to take questions and answers at the end. If you're watching on the interface, you can enter your questions in the Q&A tool right below the video, or you can put them in the group chat, and we'll pass those along to the presenters at the end of the session. So Wesley, I'll now pass the floor to you.
Right, thank you. Okay, thank you for that kind introduction. My name is Wesley Zebrowski. I'm a PhD candidate at Indiana University, just about to graduate, and so ready to kind of dive full time into doing this kind of stuff. So thank you all for attending. This talk is going to be exploring what I'm calling the Black racial gap in the Conservation Reserve Program. So this talk is very much motivated by the trend in how much different categories of farmers are receiving from conservation payments generally through the Ag Census. So as we can see in this graph here, Black farmers are receiving approximately 50% less per operation on average from conservation programs than white farmers, but also Hispanic farmers, Asian farmers, and women farmers. So really much less than even other socially disadvantaged classes of farmers. So the question is, okay, how can we explain this big difference in conservation funding? There are 2, I think, easy answers. The first is that Black farmers tend to have smaller farms and tend to own less of their acres, and so they're going to be, on that angle, kind of less qualified for having more acres in conservation programs versus other classes. The other easy answer is that the USDA and the FSA, of course, has this history of discrimination through its programming, and so that might still be driving some differences. However, with this paper, I'm really trying to dive in more deeply and cover some potentially systematic reasons why we might be seeing Black farmers have much lower uptake of these conservation programs. So the Conservation Reserve Program is, I think, a great case for trying to explore this inequity, given that it's the largest conservation program that's kind of falling into this suite of payments to farmers. So for those of you who don't know, but most of you probably do, it's a program that is essentially trying to halt agricultural production on highly erodible land for a temporary time period. Instead, farmers are typically installing perennial grasses or woody cover. Essentially, it's providing environmental benefits to society, and in return, it's providing some income support or effectively some risk management income to farmers themselves. These contracts tend to last 10 to 15 years, so they're pretty long-term, forward-looking planning from the perspective of year-to-year crop plantations. And although we saw kind of how Black farmers have less participation in the program, we could think they might theoretically be more eligible, given that Black farmers tend to farm on land that's traditionally considered more marginal, and so those lands might be a bit more erodible and thus be lands we want in the Conservation Reserve Program anyways. And so from that angle, it might be rather worrying that we're not seeing as many payments to Black farmers for trying to participate in these programs. So it's a very brief overview of where Conservation Reserve Program acres are. This is just kind of a big map. And then you can kind of see this black hatching that's really highlighting where we see Black farmers in the US. So of course, they're primarily in the South, and they are still coinciding with actual participation in the Conservation Reserve Program. So this is not a non-issue. Black farmers are participating in the program, even from a geographic sense, but there's, of course, a lot of kind of geographic and spatial clustering when trying to consider this data, this problem. Some more details on how the CRP itself works. Really, the core problem in getting this program to function well is trying to set a competitive compensation rate for farmers. So how much we pay farmers, of course, is going to be important for whether or not they want to participate. It's the trying to match the opportunity cost for those farmers so people actually have an incentive to buy in. How this is done is the federal FSA determines a rate bid cap at a county level, which kind of determines, after some modifiers, the maximum amount that a farmer is able to be paid for participating. Of course, when crop prices are high, that means that farmers have a high opportunity cost, And these rate bid caps really matter a lot, because if a farmer can earn a lot more money through farming corn or soybeans, even on land that's really poor quality or really highly erodible, then they might well do that because the program isn't going to pay them enough to not farm those lands. Another aspect of this rate setting process is that there's some local discretion and conflicts of interest, given that local county committees through the FSA can actually go through an adjustment process to adjust what their county rate is, which I'll kind of get into a bit more later. The CRP has kind of two main provisions. It is the general sign-up, which is a competitive sign-up via a reverse auction that's using the rate bid cap. And so there's some cost competitiveness, but in practice, there's not a whole lot. And there's also continuous sign-up, which is non-competitive and has no real cost competition. It just uses the rate bid cap. And so for both of these sign-ups, whatever we're setting that rate bid cap is at a county level is really important for how much farmers are actually being paid. There's also the grasslands aspect of the CRP, but I'm not going to go over that in my presentation today. So in thinking about this, I kind of first set up to theorize what I think are 5 key levers for inequity within this program. The first is that Black farmers might simply face kind of lower baseline rate caps at a county level. The idea here is, if we know Black farmers tend to work smaller farms on more marginal lands and more diversified productions, they might kind of be spatially clustered in counties that are going to have lower rental rates in order to rent land. So if land is cheaper, that means that the federal government is going to set kind of that rate bid cap at a lower level than, say, in the Midwest, where there's a lot of white farmers predominantly. And so if we have a large spatial congregation of Black farmers, then we might expect there to be a kind of a lower baseline compensation rate, given that those rates are set at the county standard average rate for renting land. Another potential lever here is that county committees might be making less rate adjustments in counties that have more Black farmers. And so the idea here is, if those farmers might not be as well represented on those committees, then they might be less likely to kind of go through this kind of very speedy and a bit cumbersome process to try to secure some adjustment to their county rate. And so we might see more adjustments in more white counties that are a bit more organized and have more financial means to kind of make these things happen. Additionally, we might be concerned about county committee representation, as a lot of other talks have talked about today. Kind of the history of discrimination kind of has really funneled a bit through local FSA county committees, and there's kind of been an ongoing problem with representing, especially Black farmers on those committees. And so if Black farmers are represented on those committees, they may lead to worse outcomes in the actual CRP enrollment. And in the next slide, I'll kind of go over in more detail how I think that might be happening. Additionally, kind of other things aside, we might expect that Black farmers simply have higher marginal opportunity costs given the nature of the average Black farm. So for a farm that's smaller or more diversified, there's probably a higher marginal opportunity cost, because when you have a smaller number of acres, losing one additional acre to the CRP is going to marginally cost you more than some 1,000-acre farm, which could probably give up, like 10 acres and not totally impact their bottom line too much. Same thing goes for what kind of commodity you're planting. If you're a kind of a smaller vegetable grower, you're going to be seeing kind of higher returns per acre than someone who's got a 1,000-acre kind of corn farm. And so it might be very different comparisons for whether or not 1 acre or less or more of a CRP enrollment is really worth it for you. And finally, there might just be a general lack of trust among Black farmers. There's been prior research really kind of documenting the probably justified lack of trust that Black farmers have in the federal government to administer these programs, given the kind of the history of discrimination that they've faced. In my paper, I'm going to really kind of dive into these first 3 levers, which I can kind of assess with some of the data I've acquired. I think the other 2 are important and would be a good thing to tackle with some future papers. Okay, so thinking about representation of the county committees, I want to point out just like how I think this might all work. So for the responsibilities the committees actually have, it's worth noting that these committees are elected by farmers, and they're farmers themselves. So of course, there's going to be some potential conflicts of interest that might be kind of getting into this process. And getting these committees to be diverse requires kind of the elections process to work okay, and for it to actually lead to demographic representation of the farmers in a committee. The committees themselves are tasked in a general sense with helping implement federal FSA programs kind of to their local jurisdiction, and then also provide feedback back to the federal FSA about kind of the conditions. And they also help work with the state committee as well. So it's kind of this three-tiered representation system. They also appoint the county committee to the head office to kind of head the day-to-day operations of the county, which might be quite important. And who is making the decisions likely influencing who is getting the job as the executive. They also provide advisement to local farmers, which in the case of the CRP might be especially helpful for farmers to help optimize their bid. Bidding in the CRP is kind of a game where you try to maximize how much money you're going to receive and kind of get your environmental benefits that you're proposing to be kind of just high enough to get accepted, at least in kind of a rational framework. Additionally, these committees are supposed to make decisions by unanimous consent, but whether or not that happens, I'm not entirely sure. And if we think about kind of actual discrimination versus representation, we can think of kind of this tension between counties potentially making punitive discrimination, which admittedly is kind of hard to find in kind of a quantitative data set, versus simply not representing the interests of Black farmers in their county if Black farmers aren't actually sitting on those committees. This leads me to kind of three analogous research questions, which is, for counties which have more Black farmers, do they have a lower maximum compensation rate for the CRP? Do they have fewer positive rate adjustments? And do they have less CRP enrollment due to underrepresentation? And I think it's worth here first defining what I mean by underrepresentation. So there's two definitions here. There's FSA's criteria, which is 1 divided by 1 plus the number of voting members. If that is less than the Black share of farmers that are allowed to vote in that kind of administrative area in that county, then I'm considering this a violation. So that means that the criteria is met to where there should be an SDA member of a given demographic, but that person is not there. If that is the case for 4 consecutive years, the federal government is authorized to then appoint an additional voting member of that underrepresented demographic. And so that's why I'm kind of using that as a quote unquote violation criteria. Then there's another criteria for underrepresented, which is a bit more traditional, which is simply like if the share of the Black percent of farmers is greater than the number of voting members when you kind of take a floor, then we might expect there to be underrepresented. So the FSA's criteria is binary, just one person is enough, but my criteria for underrepresented really cares about the total proportion. And this will be more clear with these examples. So if you take a county with 4 white seats and 1 Black seat, and it has 42% of Black farmers, the FSA's criteria would say, this is great, you've got 1 Black farmer, that's totally sufficient. But if you think about underrepresentation as number of positions rather than just a single one, my criteria would say, no, actually, you should have 2 positions because there's 42% of the farmers that are Black and 40% of 5 is 2. And so that wouldn't cut it for my definition of representation here. However, these can kind of go both ways too. So technically the FSA's has a lower threshold for representation because they're adding an additional 1 in there for reasons that are boring to explain but are important here. So there are going to be some scenarios where actually the FSA's criteria says it's not okay, but my underrepresented criteria says actually it's fine. The proportion doesn't quite reach enough to demand a seat. For data, I'm just looking at a study window of 2008-2022. I've got data on CRP rental rates, rate requests, enrollment data. This is from NASS and the FSA. I also have data on farmer racial demographics through the Ag Census for 2002 through 2017. And specifically, I'm looking at primary producer here. I also have data on the active cropland and eligible land for CRP through the cropland data letter. This is applying kind of the eligibility criteria for CRP enrollment, which varies by farm bill. I also have data on FSA program payments as provided from the FSA via FOIA. And I also have data on the demographic composition and position types of FSA county committees as also acquired from the FSA through FOIA. So for my empirical methods, I kind of take a different model to address each of these 3 questions. The first one I simply address with descriptive statistics. I think this tells the story best, and I'll go over it in a moment. For the second question, I'm looking at a coarsened exact matching model. The idea with this model is essentially it is a many-to-many matching that matches farmers based on binning a number of variables. So if you have acres between 1 and 100, you might be in the same bin. And then all farms, which are in the same bins as each other on kind of like an n-dimensional grid, will match together. Any farmers that we can't find a match for are just discarded. And the treatment here is whether or not a given county has a rate request. So I'm matching counties with rate requests to most similar counties that don't have rate requests, and I'm going to look at the demographic differences between those counties. For answering the representation question, I employ a fixed effects linear regression model on CRP enrollment outcomes. For both of these models, I don't have my long list of controls in the presentation for the sake of time, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A or individually afterwards if you connect with me. So for the first research question, do Black farmer counties have a lower compensation rate? And this is again answered with descriptive statistics. So here's my nice graph trying to tell this story. So on the top left here, we see that we have the kind of maximum compensation rate, the county soil renter rate, and the x-axis here is the percent of Black farmers in that county. And what we can see is that counties that are all white compared to Black, or all not Black, have a higher range and a kind of a higher distribution of compensation rates. And then that compensation rate drops as counties get more Black. So this blue line here is the average compensation rate for counties in that category. There's also a red line you can't see. The difference between those two lines is whether or not I account for rate requests. There's no difference that you can see in this graph, which is simply to say that while I look at rate requests, on the average, they aren't that important. And so the takeaway is pretty clear that simply by the matter of which counties they're living in, Black farmers are going to receive less for their CRP bids, even if they're receiving the maximum amount that they're allowed, compared to white farmers in other parts of the country. However, you might think, okay, well, this is fine if those Black farmers in counties with more Black farmers have less environmental benefits to offer. However, the top right graph is showing us that the average non-cost environmental benefits is pretty flat across counties. So there isn't really any substantial on average difference in how many benefits these CRP acres are providing to the program. On the bottom left, we're then showing county average CRP acres, again, as a share of principal operator Black. And we can see that white farmer counties tend to participate more in the CRP. There's kind of a drop off, but we do still see participation in these Black farmer counties. That's perhaps understandable given that they are being paid systematically less as a result of which counties they're in. This graph on the bottom right is the same graph, but looking specifically at continuous acres, and it's essentially the same trend. The next question is, do Black farmer counties have fewer rate adjustments? And again, I'm looking at this using my Corson's exact matching model. So what I find is that counties that have an accepted rate request, that means the county proposed the rate request, and then it got sent to the federal government, and the federal government accepted it, those counties are about 0.94 percentage points less Black. And so when you apply that to the mean, that means that they have about like 18.7% less Black farmers than the county mean. This is driven by cross-state comparisons. So a county in Alabama comparing to a county in Mississippi, any county in one state versus a county in another state. That's really what's driving the variation here. However, there's no significant impact for submitting a rate request. So we're only seeing a racial difference for counties that have accepted rate requests, not those that are simply submitting them to the federal government. And when I look at this in terms of underrepresentation or violations, those don't seem to be associated with rate adjustments at all. So there's some sort of demographic story happening, but it's not necessarily driven by underrepresentation per se. And then I also apply this to other demographic categories. So while I'm in here doing all these models, it is simple enough to also run this for Hispanic farmers, Asian farmers, and women farmers, and I thought they would serve as good reference groups. So again, when we look at these, in this case, combined requested and accepted rate request counties, they tend to be less Hispanic, and those counties have less Hispanic farmers in the representation on FSA committees. So for Hispanic farmers, it does seem to be driven by a lack of representation on those committees. And this variation is driven by interstate comparison, so counties within the same state. And when I look at differences for women and Asian farmers, I don't really find any impact for these rate requests. The last research question is, do counties with underrepresented Black farms have worse outcomes? And again, here I'm using my two-way fixed effects model. And I find that Black underrepresentation is associated with 0.6 to 0.7% less CRP enrollment than the mean county. So when you apply this kind of a rough to dirty mean, that's accounting for about 3.9 less acres than the mean on a mean of about 533.8 acres. This isn't exactly accurate given kind of some differences in weighting, but for the purpose of interpretation, it's pretty sufficient. But when I look at FSA's violation criteria, as opposed to kind of the continuous underrepresentation, I find that the violation criteria doesn't seem to matter at all. And also that the violation rate is really quite high. So about 50% of committees, of committee years per se, have violations. So there's a lot of violations and a lot of underrepresentation, but it's really underrepresentation that's explaining differences in CRP enrollment. Additionally, I thought, interestingly, I don't seem to find an impact of advisors. So if a county has an advisor that's Black to kind of advise the county committee in their duties, that doesn't really seem to matter at all for outcomes, at least within my model. When I apply this to other demographic categories, I find that women also are kind of suffering from underrepresentation, which is associated with about 0.22 to 0.26% less CRP enrollment. And I find some mixed support across a variety of other positions. So women are also having the same impact for violations, but they also seem to have some negative effect from having women voting members. So there's kind of this damned if you do, damned if you don't narrative going on, where when they're not represented, it's leading to poor outcomes. But when they get too much representation, that's also creating some poor outcomes, potentially due to like conflict within those committees. I do, however, see a positive effect when Hispanic farmers are in committee leadership positions, when they're the chair or vice chair, leads to more enrollment in CRP. And I see a negative effect for Asian voting members, which might be explained by the same theory of conflict happening within committees when kind of demographics finally get represented. So unpacking all of this and talking about how this might tie to some policy, as a brief summary, I think we see a threefold disparity in Black conservation payments, just kind of looking at these kind of structural and representative arguments. So we've got some lower county level maximum compensation rates, just by the fact of where Black farmers happen to live. We also see less positive adjustments to those rates by county committees, and there's lower enrollment in the actual program when Black farmers are underrepresented. I'd like to point out here that what I don't think is happening is that county boards are imposing penalties on Black farmers. Rather, I think it's more likely that there's kind of less advisement happening and less representation of those Black farmers in the decision-making process. But the consequence is really kind of the same across these three takeaways, which is that Black farmers are simply participating less and receiving less in the CRP than farmers in white counties. And some quick policy implications before my time's up here. I think it's important to note that committee representation seems to be an ongoing problem and obstacle to achieving programmatic equity. And in particular, what's worrying is that FSA's standard for representation does not really seem to impact outcomes, at least in this case, in this model. Rather, we might want to consider a more continuous measure of representation rather than a binary one and done. In particular, this might imply that decisions may not be unanimous in practice, because in theory, if a demographic is represented, then they might be able to impact unanimous decisions, and that might solve the problem. But clearly, it's a bit more nuanced here. I also think we should just kind of normatively consider the importance of demographics that are below a representation threshold. So both of the measures I presented are pretty conservative. If there's only 10% of Black farmers in a county and a county's got 4 seats, they will never be technically given that seat from a representation standpoint. But those 10% of farmers are still 10% of farmers in a county, and their experience matters a lot and matters for program outcomes. And regardless, I think this is also another kind of indication that we might want to revisit this county rate system that the CRP uses and pivot from what's essentially least cost conservation policy to trying to pay people more proportional to the actual benefits they provide. So thank you for listening. Here's my email if you're interested in sending me any questions or following up afterwards. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Wesley. Aparna, I think you're up next.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think Wesley has actually done half of my job by giving all the hints that we are going to talk about in this paper too. So the problem here is that agricultural conservation from the beginning has always had some issues that we need to think about. And as Wesley was also talking about, that we need to think how to make it better from the policy perspective so that we can have a more equal access to all the conservation policies. To answer this question, to basically not answer this question, I don't really have the answer. To understand the perspective, in this paper, I will take you back to the beginning of the agricultural conservation policies inside USA. So that was the result of 1930s Dust Bowl. So I will start from that point, and then we will trace those policies over time to see how those policies had different kind of, partially discrimination and partially coming from different sorting too. So let's start. This paper is on local institution. I mostly work on financial and technical policies coming from the agricultural conservation different programs. This paper is on local institutions and collective action. These programs starting from the, theoretically, if you start to think, local institutions, collective action inside the natural resource management, especially conservation, has been a big part of the theoretical economics, public policy, political science. I'm not going through many citations here, but in general, it was initially proposed by Elinor Ostrom, and then many people are still working on local institutions, trying to understand how local institutions can be a substitute of federal policies. So in this paper, my purpose is to understand how these local institutions, especially conservation institutions, we can make it more effective. We can give different people equal chances and access to institutional frameworks so that they can have the highest benefit from those conservation policies. And I have some part of the paper primarily focused on climate resilience, because primarily these policies, especially this local institution, was created after the 1930s Dust Bowl. So a big purpose was to think about climate resilience through these local institutions. Effectiveness of these local institutions has always been like, as we all were kind of in the same path, that it's very hard to gather a data set and you can trace conservation kind of questions over time. It's not easy. So in this paper, I will do different kind of archival work to basically gather all the information about these conservation policies from the beginning to see how the creation and then the expansion of local institution, and both the preliminary, the creation, and then the expansion, both had many discriminatory issues that we should discuss. So a big part of this paper is about archival work that I will show you what I'm talking about, and then we can discuss about the policies initiation too. So probably you all are familiar with this, but I still want to give you a framework. This happened in 1930s, the Dust Bowl, the way we know it as Dust Bowl. And Dust Bowl, basically, the reason was that if you look at this map, on this, I think you can see the map. So in the map, this is mostly the Great Plains, and Great Plains soil, if you know, it's very sandy soil. What USA farmers started to do when they went to the frontier, they didn't understand that this soil is so sandy, and this soil will not survive if we don't have enough grassland. So because of the cropland, they wanted to cultivate the land. USDA also had a different financial incentive to like with the Homestead Act and all that. So farmers started to take grassland out of the soil, which made soil very much sandy. Like the soil is sandy if you don't have the grassland. And then the soil with wind, it started to blow, and that was the Dust Bowl. So if you think about 1930s, this was the scenario all over the Great Plains, and the soil was coming to Chicago, to Washington, DC, like all across the USA eastern frontier. So now, if that is the case, you can think about it like continuous drought, especially because of the rainfall shortage and the wind shock. Destruction of grassland, soil started to blow, and then in 1933, Frederick Roosevelt came to the power. We all know about the New Deal. New Deal started most of the farmland conservation programs that we talk about today. Most of those programs have been started in 1933 after the New Deal. So pre-Dust Bowl, like before this Dust Bowl program, Dust Bowl area, before that farmland conservation, there was a little bit conservation. If you think about the extension service, there was some understanding, but it was never like a there was no federal policies. So post-Dust Bowl farmland conservation started in 1933, as I said, and it was started with a financial subsidy, not with an institution. It was started only with a financial subsidy that, okay, we need grassland back to the soil. So let's give farmers some kind of financial subsidy so that they can put the cropland back, which is still today is known as CRP. Mostly that is the idea of CRP. Now, alternatively, what happened that eventually in like 3-4 years, USDA started to understand that farmers inside USA from the beginning, even today, they don't like the idea that somebody else will come from the DC and then they will give some kind of instruction that this is what you should do and I will give you money. That idea was not very popular. So in 1937, USDA's soil scientist, he was a really big name back then, and probably we all should know his name. Hugh Bennett came up with this idea that maybe we should try to give farmers some level of independence, some level of like you can design your plan, you can take care of your land by yourself. I'm not going to step in your program. I just want to teach you. I will give you technical support, not any kind of authoritarian perspective. So 1937, second New Deal was the beginning of this that I call a new local institution, and we all know them as soil conservation districts. Soil conservation districts started in 1937. So this creation, this is the local institution that I'm going to follow over time to understand how and why and where some farmers cannot get equal access like others. The answer will mostly depend on land ownership, but then we will discuss more other details like what can happen. It started with the federal law, but then all the states, 50 states has their own Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. The first one was enacted in 1937. Then by 1945, 1949, all the states had their own state law. So it started in 1937. So now, if you look at this budget, it's a USDA budget from the beginning, you have to look at the, I think it's blue. I'm not, that's the blue line that you are, this one. So you see, this is the technical assistance line. I have another paper only focusing on the green line. We can discuss about that later if you are interested. But in this paper, I'm talking about the technical assistance, this blue line, which is not really, as you see, it's not a financial assistance. So it is not actually about money. It's about conservation technicians giving different kind of support to understand what kind of planning you should do if you have this kind of soil, which is actually a big deal. So in this paper, I will at first try to understand the formation of these conservation districts, starting from the beginning, which will depend empirically, which is a survival analysis. So I will try to understand what are the factors that influence farmers to take a decision about conservation districts much faster than other farmers. What are the things? Is it just the land ownership? Is it some kind of knowledge externality? Is it some kind of just the location effect? Racial, tenure, land on tenure, tenancy, land tenancy, all those things. And after doing that survival analysis, after understanding what are the factors behind the formation, we will we can push the question more, and we will try to understand how does the soil conservation district actually help a community to be more climate resilient if it does. And I will do different kind of causal identification because that's what I do. But in general, that's the question. We will try to understand the mechanisms to understand the importance of a soil conservation district. Is it something that we should focus more? And what determines the heterogeneity of our space? It's important because everybody had equal access, but as you can see, like in 2-3 minutes, you will see not that everybody could manage equally. So now data construction, it was like a 2-3 years work depending on different archival database. So I will show you what I have been trying to do. The data mostly came from National Archives at College Park. They have the deposit of all the maps, initial maps, all the information around the beginning of the soil conservation districts. What was the narrative? What was the political formation process? What was the election? What was the county groups? Those narrative reports, and there were collective effort to join all the calculation, like what are the different kind of soil conservation we should follow and how much money we need from the USDA, this kind of annual reports. I'll show you some in 1 minute. And then I overlay this data with the data set that we have, county level agricultural census, population census. I have some county government information too. And the other variables are pretty standard climate variables. So now let's look at the maps. So if you see in this map, these are the maps that I have collected from the archives. It's the formation map, like in which year, what are the counties who actually had at least one conservation district. So that's an important point to think about. Federal government actually did not have any kind of imposition. It said like, okay, as long as you 25 farmers can come together, you can create a conservation district. But over time, if today you look at the conservation districts, it's actually every county border other than Nebraska, I think, has one conservation district. So political boundary was not an imposition from the federal government, but eventually over time, it just adjusted with the county border. So that's an important point to keep in mind. If you look at from the beginning, this is from 1934. This is for 1938. So just after the beginning of the policy, you see, not a lot of conservation districts, but it's started just in 1 year. These are the first farmers who took who took a step to create conservation districts. Now, this is for 1944. You can see many counties already created conservation districts. 2 states who actually does not have any conservation districts until 1950. Mostly, it's Missouri and Pennsylvania. I have a paper on that too, like what kind of bureaucratic conflict happened in these 2 states and why they were not really being able to create conservation districts. So that was very much like kind of a conflict in between USDA and NRCS. Like back then it was Soil Conservation Service, SCS, and Farm Bureau. So that's an interesting point. But in general, up until 1950, you can see most of the counties were in the process of creating the conservation districts. But again, you need to keep in mind that creating a conservation district is not the purpose. The purpose was the effectiveness of the conservation districts. So now if you see in this map, see, most of the counties who actually had a conservation district, but the percentage that they actually are doing some kind of soil conservation is pretty limited. Only the red ones have more than 50% of the conservation area. Other than that, it's not. So these are the maps that I collected to understand the formation process. And I also want to show you the annual reports, because those are the reports that helped me to create a panel database on conservation over time to see who actually can do conservation, who have the access. I mean, when I say who can do, I kind of mean to say who has more access to conservation. So this is just a randomly, I did it for the whole Great Plains. I will just randomly show you one in Oklahoma. This is Atota County's map. So I will go to Atota County's report to show you all the details of the information that you have from the narrative and the reports in general. So this is the annual report of soil conservation districts created in the Atota County. So the report starts with supervisor's name. So and then you have the educational activities that you can see here. So these educational activities were highly influenced by the extension service. Extension service helped a lot soil conservation district, at least in Oklahoma. In Kansas, extension service was very active. In some places it was not. So these are all the educational activities that happened in that area. Then the resources of the district, so like total cropland, total pasture. This is just the information that we also have from the agricultural census. But agricultural census up until today, it does not really do a good job on conservation. So This is the extent of district and influence. So how many acres are under conservation agreement, how many cooperators are there. You can see all the names, how many people are even planning for the conservation for next year. That's also those kind of information you can get from here. The main information that I used is from this page that has all the conservation names, like what are the different kind of conservation activities these farmers are doing. So conversion, cropland practices, work in land conservation, then grassland practices, woodland, wildlife, and then structural practices, which technically means like tree plantation type of long-term conservation practices. So now that you have, I have this information starting from 1937 and annual report, so you can actually have a panel database to see what is the primarily what is the formation process, who can get access to conservation districts more, and then trying to understand what is the effect of these conservation districts. My empirical strategy, I will probably not spend a lot of time. It's just general empirical framework with the survival model. Survival model is basically a logit model. It's nothing really as much complicated as it looks like. The survival model will help you to understand why some farmers can do it faster than other farmers. So basically your Y variable, your outcome variable is a time, is the time, the duration to study the fact. So we can understand the factors behind the temporal variation in this policy to event analysis. Here, mainly your parameter is the beta. I will show you the table in 2 minutes. And so all probabilities will be calculated, use the hazard model, just the standard hazard model. So that was the survival model at the initial. And then also I have a model for the impact evaluation of these programs, which is the trying to understand how different kind of outcome variable can change because of the existence of the soil conservation districts and the effectiveness of soil conservation districts. So I will start with land value, then I will look at yield, I will look at infant mortality too, because back then at least it was a big deal start with the dust. Now, the main information, a big information that I try to advocate for, it's around this soil conservation district is, look at this map. This is the establishment of demonstration plot. So initially, as USDA knew that farmers do not know how to take care of their land that much as at least USDA thought they should. So USDA started to establish demonstration plot all across the USA. You can see only for the Great Plains and around the area, because in this paper, most of the papers results are for the Great Plains. Only some results are for the whole USA. But you can see how these demonstration plots actually give create a knowledge externality kind of issue. That means if you live around the demonstration plot, you have a better access to this education. You can go to the land, you can see what kind of soil they have and how far they are from your own soil quality. And then you can decide what kind of conservation activities you should do on your land. So this demonstration plot was an important inequality creator, at least at the beginning of the conservation districts, which, we can think about the racial and other dimensions later, but this is only a spatial variation coming from the establishment of the demonstration plots. Now, these are just the drought model that I will use as the climate shock. Probably I can talk about this later. Let's look at some results. So now you can see this is my survival result. I didn't put a lot of results here because I don't have that much time. I have the paper ready, so if you want to read more, I can share with you. This is a normal Weibull distribution model. You can see, as I was just talking about, demonstration plot has decided the influence on the who can actually create this conservation district is highly tied who has access to the demonstration plot. Because we are talking about 1930s, 40s, and still today, farmers who know about the existence of different conservation programs, who know the knowledge externality, knowledge generation process inside this conservation matters a lot, and which probably we should think more as a policy procedure too. And then you can see the farmers who got the New Deal money, they were also much faster. land grant universities to some extent, they helped a lot. Another thing you probably should start to think a lot, that I think for Wesley's paper, the CRP one is also pretty much important, that thinking about the tenants, proportion of tenants. The tenants, here the thing is that back then, in the Great Plains, it was like 45 to 50% of the farmers were tenants, but tenants don't really have a voice in any kind of local institutions in most of the conservation programs. So how should we think about tenants, given that we have a high proportion of tenants and we cannot really keep creating conservation programs that do not have access for these farmers? So that's an important point to keep in mind in this survival analysis, that tenants, if the proportion of tenants is high, the access to the conservation district is pretty much low. So this is the initial survival model, and I did it with different kind of distributional model. Most of the times the results are pretty much same. So we probably need to think more about the knowledge externality and think about the land institutions, land tenants institutions, how to give everybody equal access to these conservation districts. Now, let's go to more details of the results coming from the effect of the soil conservation districts. As you can see, yes, it's true that soil conservation districts helped these counties to be more economically developed, and I will show in a little bit that probably a little more climate resilient too, but it's very concentrated. The effects are mostly concentrated in areas where farmers know about these conservation districts for a long. They have this knowledge, and you can see with time the effect is much higher at the initial, because it takes time to understand what kind of planning you should do. There are so many conservation activities, and you need to pick up which one goes with your soil. Mostly like working land conservation activities. Then also you another thing to keep in mind, that high erosion areas, like back then the soil erosion, most erodible land were the areas where farmers took the advantage of conservation districts much more than other areas. If you want to look at this climate resilience, like drought resilience, by climate short at this moment, I'm mostly talking about the drought resilience, but starting from 1957 was the second big drought. And in this table is primarily showing you that even if the effect of the Dust Bowl was very high in the 1930s, 1957, a similar drought happened, but the effect on the farmers is much lower if they have access to a conservation district. If I'm clear, like what I'm trying to say, that conservation districts helped farmers to reduce the negative effect on drought in the next big drought in 1957. And that's also, you can see it's very concentrated. It's not like all the farmers had equal access. So then I will show you a little more about the utilizing the distance to the conservation districts, and you can see this is a continuous treatment. So I'm working on the whole acreage of conservation district, and still you can see it's mostly concentrated into high and medium erosion areas. So that's the that's coming from the distance to the demonstration plot. Distance to the demonstration plot initially was a big factor, because many farmers did not have, like, they cannot really go to 50 kilometers away just to see the conservation activities. I did not put many more tables. I will just talk about this because it's a very important thing to think about. Like, okay, we understand conservation district has a positive effect, very much concentrated but positive effect. Now, who are the farmers who can get access to the conservation districts more and who can exploit the idea of conservation districts more? As you can see here from the heterogeneous different kind of treatment effect, it's basically effects are larger for the farms who has the capacity to do conservation. Its also effects are very small. I mean, most of the times effect doesn't even exist with higher tenancy ratio. And then effects are larger with more education service from extension service. So extension service most of the times work as a complement with the soil conservation district. In the places where extension service had some kind of issues with conservation district, mostly political, like mostly who get how much money, in those kind of areas, it's very hard for farmers to utilize the benefit coming from the both of these institutions. And also I have more like results in the paper trying to show how infant mortality rate also has a relationship with existence of different conservation activities, because they reduced the dust, and dust was like really super bad for especially people who are below 5 years old. And then different kind of yield, and if for the yield I got a really interesting result that conservation helps a lot when it is a bad harvest year. Conservation doesn't really help a lot when it's a really good year. In the good years, when you have access to rainfall and all that, access to irrigation, in those years probably conservation doesn't really make a lot of positive impact on the yield per acre. So this is the end of the paper of the presentation, and if you want to read the paper, I'll be very happy to share with you. And I am just stopping now, going back to Stephen.
All right, thank you, Aparna. And now we'll transition to our final speaker, Tong.
Okay, so let me share my screen first. Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to present my paper titled Factors Affecting Farmers' Carbon Farming Decisions in the U.S. Midwest. My name is Tong Wang. I'm an associate professor and advanced production specialist from Net School of Management Economics in South Dakota State University. So first, let me give you some background. So as we know, there's an increase in greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere, so which caused various problems, including the increasing temperature and rising sea levels. Therefore, 124 counties by 2021 have pledged to reach carbon neutrality or net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or 2060. And we have an increasing number of companies also pledged to reduce their carbon emissions, but it's very costly for them to reduce emissions with the current technologies. So they have another option, which is to purchase the carbon sequester in the soils to offset their carbon emissions. So carbon market provides opportunities for farmers to receive the payment if they change their practice and sequester more carbon in the soils. So we can see there's the number of carbon programs are rapidly growing. However, the fraction of farmers who have signed the carbon contract is only 1% by 2022. And to our awareness, no study have investigated the carbon supply, elasticity, and the influencing factors for farmers' carbon farming decisions. So our study tried to bridge those gaps. So as you can see from this table, if farmers adopt different conservation practices, such as cover crops, diversified crop rotation, no-till, and reduced-till, so they can sequester different amount of carbon in their soil. And so we can see each practice range of carbon sequestration. This depends on the fields, the soil, the climate factors, or the previous adopted practices. And if farmers adopt more than one practice, they can sequester more carbon. So here we have some carbon payment by different programs. So we actually divided them into different criteria. So one is paying by dollar per mg, which is the metric ton, and the other is dollar per acre. So on the dollar per mg basis, we can see that most carbon programs provide a carbon payment of about $20 or $30. And on the per acre basis, they provide between $10 and $30 per acre. And for farmers to receive payment, there are some criteria for them. So they have to qualify for example, there is a requirement for the practices that is newly implemented. So only the new and expanded practice are eligible. However, some practices also specify some previous adopted practice could be still be eligible if they are adopted. So we can look at the contract length of the carbon contract. So here I list some examples I found from their website. So we can see that even though there are some companies offer a 1-year contract, but most of them require 5 years or even 10 years. So they need a multiple year to be in that contract. So there are several reasons we try to look at what prevents farmers from enrolling in the carbon programs, because only 1% of farmers are in the program. So we can see that 64% of farmers think payment level is too low, and the others may think that they may comply to the contract, or some farmers doubt the carbon sequestration viability, and some farmers, they may already use those practices, so they are no longer eligible. So we try to look at, if farmers' main concern is the payment level offered, then what is their desirable level of payment? So we carried out a survey in Midwest, which is 4 states, which includes South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota. So those 4 states in 2021, so we sent out 6,000 surveys with 1,500 in each state. So we receive about 20% response rate, and with more than 1,000 samples to analyze. So here is the question, the main question we ask in our survey questionnaire. So we give farmer a basic information that a well-managed cropland can sequester about 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. So which means that if they adopt different practices like cover crop, rotational grazing, and rotational like carbon like different practices, they can sequester 1 ton of carbon per acre per year. So we ask them, would you like to change your practice in order to sequester carbon or reduce the greenhouse gas emissions? So we provide them with 6 price levels from $10 all the way to $70 per ton. And for each of the payment level, we give them 3 options. They can answer no, not sure, or yes. So here is what we found out. So it's not surprising. So we can see that as we increase the dollar amount, the number of farmers who answer yes actually gradually increase, and those who answer no gradually decrease. But we can see the not sure is kind of consistent among different prices. So we can see at the current payment level, which is about $20 per ton, only 4% of farmers, they are willing to just change their practices at this price level. So if it increase to $30, it increased to 11%, still not high. But if it increase all the way to $70 per ton, then 50% of farmers, they are willing to change their practices to sequester more carbon. So those are the what we found from the percent of producers who answered yes or no, not sure for our questions. And if we think about the logic, how does the farmer answer a question like this? So we would think about, they would think about the cost and the benefit. So what is the cost that is involved in the carbon contract? So the potential cost of the carbon program, so the farmers could incur some soil test cost, and they might incur the verification cost for the carbon sequestered. And in order to use some new practices such as no-till, they would need a new equipment, and they also need to incur some increased input cost. For example, if they use cover crops, they need to spend more input on the cover crop seeds. If they use no-till, there's a higher cost on the herbicide. So those are the increased input cost. And finally, there is a learning cost, because there is a learning curve. So farmers may not gain any benefit in the first few years, but they need to spend time learning about the new practice. And now with the cost, they need to consider how about the benefit. So the benefit here, they can receive, one is a carbon payment by the carbon programs, and they may just experience a yield increase, may not. And other co-benefits they might also experience is the soil health improvement, environmental benefits. Those are the possible benefits they would experience. So now with the cost and benefits, the farmer will think about whether I have the benefit exceeds the cost. If that way, they answer yes. So normally it happens at a higher price range. And if the carbon price or carbon payment is too low, it won't cover the cost, they will answer no. And if they're really not quite sure, because farmers may not know what exactly are the costs I incurred for this program, or what are exactly the benefit are, so they are not sure. So these are the intermediate price range. So why we see that some farmers answer yes, some farmers answer no, some are not sure. I think they have different evaluation of the benefits from different practices on their farm. So here is some example of farmers' answers. So you can see that I generally break their response into two big categories. One category is on the left. We can see 51% of farmers in the first category here. This category I denote as farmers who are waiting to enroll at a price less or equal to $70, which means at the price we provided, they at least answered one yes. In that way, they are categorized in the first category. However, if they answered just no, not sure, then they are in the second category. So those farmers, they are not willing to enroll at the price we provided, up to $70. And if we look at more into the detail, we can see that for farmers, some farmers answered yes throughout. So 4% of farmers, they answer yes all the way through. And some, like 10% farmers answer no all the way through. And the large the large population, we can see that 30% of farmers, they answer not sure for all the price levels. So which means actually 1/3 of farmers, they don't know what to choose. So this could be because they are lacking knowledge in the carbon sequestration level or the benefit they could receive from the different practices. So there's lots of people, they are not sure, which means they are generally a lack of information among farmers in the carbon market. So here we look at the supply elasticity in different price ranges. So we can see that, so here you can see the 4 lines, because we surveyed producers from 4 states. So we generally break them into different states and to see whether there are different trends in different states. Generally, we can see there is a high overlap with those 4 lines. So that means the producer behavior in those 4 states are generally consistent. So if we look at the price range between $10 and $20, we can see the supply in this price range is inelastic. And then from $20 to $50, the supply elasticity here is greater than 1. So which means if we increase the price under this price range, the producers will be very responsive in changing their practices. And when we reach the here the threshold of $50, and from $50 to $70, again, the supply here is inelastic again. So which means if we further increase the price, then farmers may not be responsive. So the reason may not be a price reason, could be other information gap reasons. And we look at different factors that could affect farmers' carbon supply decisions. So one factor we look at is the farm size. So we divide farms into small farm and large farm based on their, so here we basically we choose the farms with less than 500 acres. and large farms with more than 2,000 acres. So we can see that between $10 and $40, their decisions are pretty much the same. However, on the if we can see that if the price exceeds $50 up to $70, then there is a big gap between those farms. So the large farms, as in the orange line shows here, the large farms, they still want to increase their carbon supply at a high price level, but the small farms generally kind of stagnate the curve. So later on, we found out the small farms have more uncertainty about the carbon programs. So that explains the lack of increase in the high price level. And if we check the old farmers, which is with age greater than 60 years, and young farmers less than equal to 60 years, we can find a similar thing. So in the high price range, the young farmers are still very responsive, but old farmers, they just are kind of stagnate at a high price level, which means it's not the price level, it's different factors that affect their decision making. And another factor we checked is the producer's attitude. So we asked them whether you are willing to implement conservation practices if they involve additional cost. That means that they have to pay additional cost out of their own pocket. In that way, so we found some producers, if they answer yes, some producers, they answer no. So those who answer yes are definitely more responsive to the carbon market prices. At each price level, they are more likely to supply. But for those who are less likely to adopt with additional cost, they are less likely to adopt. Similar thing happens with the liability to asset ratio. So here we checked the farmers with no liability versus those with high liability greater than 40%. So we can see that those with higher liability, they are more likely to enroll in the carbon programs. So which could be because the carbon programs offer them opportunity to get some additional income. So with those variables that are affecting farmer decisions, we further checked the regression variables in our analysis. So the variables we include the farmer's age, which is about 59 years on average, and we checked their education. So education level completed, which varies from high school to all the way to advanced degree. So on average, farmers have some college or technical school. So age range here, we provide different age ranges from 18 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, all the way to 71 plus. So the reason we check the age range is because if there are two decision makers in the farm and they belong to different age range, so generally we think that the younger farmers are more adaptive to the new practices. They are relatively quick learners, so they can adopt new practices relatively easily. However, the older farmers, they have more financial resources generally. So if they have more than one age range, so we would think that with more than one age range, the farmers, their combination is more likely to make the changes. And we also check the ownership effect, gross sales, and liability. So other things we checked including the farmers' goals and the perceptions. And here we have their perceptions on the climate trend. We asked them, what's your agreement level towards the rising temperature, more severe wet conditions, or more drought conditions? The reason we ask this is we try to find out whether they agree with the climate change. And if they agree, we think that perhaps they are more likely to enroll in the carbon agreement. And we also checked whether the farmers willing to implement conservation practices, even they involve additional cost. So 1 to 5 just ranges from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Economic sense, that is farmers' view on the whether climate smart practices reduce soil erosion makes economic sense for their farms. And then environmental footprint, that shows whether they view reducing environmental footprint as a goal on their farm. So which ranges from not important to extremely important. And most farmers think that's kind of a somewhat important goal. And we also check the percentage of the highly erodible land, which ranges from 0% to more than 30%. And then the saline and salty conditions, which the percentage of cropland has saline and salty conditions. And we also check the land capability class 1 and 2. So those are the land most suitable for crop production. And the precipitation temperature, we have generally a large variation among the surveyed counties, which varies from slightly over 300 to nearly 600 millimeters from May to September. And the Celsius temperature varies from May to September, varies from 16 to 22 degrees. So first, we want to find out what factors affect farmers' enrollment decisions. Because we found that about half of the producers, they are waiting to enroll if the prices are sufficiently high, but 50% of producers, they are not willing to enroll at any of the prices we provided here. So we want to find out what types of producers they are willing to enroll. So basically, so here we found, okay, so what's the factors affecting farmers' willingness to enroll in the carbon programs? So age here we found is a factor that is negatively affect their willingness to enroll, which makes sense. As we can see, the old farmers, they are less responsive even at the high price ranges. Education has a positive effect, which means farmers receive higher education, they are more likely to enroll in the carbon programs. And gross sales, which means large farms, they are more likely to get enrolled. And those who want to adopt those practices, even if they involve additional cost, they are more likely to enroll. And those who think those conservation practices make economic sense, they are also more likely to enroll in the carbon programs. Another factor is the field. If their fields has more percentage of land with saline or salty conditions, they are more likely to enroll in the carbon programs. And we found the temperature increase, there is a negative effect. Basically, the lower temperature are more likely to enroll in the program. So this is the likelihood to enroll. Another thing we look at is what about their acceptable payments? Because we know that the acceptable payments ranges from $10 all the way to $70. Like at $10, and again, for the $20, 3% say yes, but all the way to $70, especially at $40, $50, and $70, there are more producers said yes. So basically, we can see that up to $30, only about 20% of producers who said yes. But from up to from $40 to $70, about 80% producers said yes. So we want to find out what type of producers they want to enroll in the carbon program at a lower cost. So here we found out is those who have more than one age ranges, that means they have one young farmer, one old farmer in their operation, they are more likely to accept a lower carbon payment. And large farmers, they want to accept, even though they are more likely to enroll, they need a higher payment. Additional cost, so those who need, I think they don't need additional cost, they can enroll at a lower cost. And those who think reducing environmental footprint is an important goal, they can also accept the carbon payment at a lower level. And this is the producers with a high percentage of land under land capacity level of 1 and 2, which means their land is highly suitable for crop production. Those producers, they need a higher payment. Lastly, we check their uncertainty levels. As we can see that some producers, some answer 2 not sure, and all the way to 6 not sures. So not many people actually have 3 or 4 or 5 not sures, but lots of people have 6 not sures. That means they don't know what to choose at all price levels. So those producers likely need more information. So we try to find out what's the producers who are not sure what to choose. So here we found is, so the blue bar here is the producers who are just more likely to be less likely to be not sure. So for example, education. So education, when education increases with higher education, people generally are less not sure about, more sure about what to choose. And ownership, this means if farmers own more land, more of the land they operate, they are more likely to answer either yes or no, but not sure. So gross sales, large farms, they also have less uncertainty. Those who think it makes economic sense, they have less uncertainty. But those 3, age range, additional cost, environmental footprint, so those people either fall into 2 age ranges, even though they are more likely to accept a lower carbon price level, but they have more uncertainty. So to summarize our findings, so basically we found like most farmers require higher carbon payments than offered by the current carbon programs. And we found out the factors that significantly enhance farmers' likelihood of carbon program enrollment included higher education, large farm size, and more land under certain and solid conditions. And the farmers who are more willing to adopt at additional cost, and those who trust more into the co-benefits of the conservation practices, they are more likely to enroll. In contrast, older farmers and farmers located in regions with higher temperature, they are less likely to enroll. And among the farmers who are willing to enroll in the carbon programs, we found those who are willing to bear additional cost and who are more interested in reduce carbon footprint, they are more likely to enroll at low carbon prices. In contrast, farmers who have better land quality, they are less likely to enroll at low prices. And we also found farmers with lower education, those who operate small-scale farms, and those who have more land under lease, they are more likely to express higher uncertainty. So here are our recommendations based on our findings. First, we feel like farmers have to gain more ban programs in order to get a higher participation rate. So either through the increased carbon payment, or there could be different programs, education programs, provide farmers with a better understanding of the co-benefits of those conservation programs through the soil, yields, or profit. Second, we feel like there should be a reduced cost associated with the carbon markets. So the costs associated with new equipment, learning, measurement, verification purposes could pose a barrier for farmers' adoption. So therefore, some monetary subsidies or exchange support could help producers lower the cost and make carbon programs more affordable. The third is because of the high level uncertainty, so there should be more techniques to reduce uncertainty and increase farmer trust in the carbon markets. So first, we should have established consistent and transparent protocols for carbon measurement and verification. And then there should be increased availability and accessibility of educational material to farmers, especially to the groups that have expressed higher level of uncertainty. Okay, thank you all for your attention. And those are all my slides. And I want to acknowledge the financial support provided by USDA-ERS, and my contact information is on the left. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong. So I don't see any specific questions, but I think one question for all of the presenters that I might have is I was wondering if you could all maybe sort of in the context of the different programs and policies that you talk about, if you could just talk a little bit and highlight sort of the economic magnitude of your findings. So sort of how should we think about the magnitude in the context of your presentation? If you guys can go in any order.
I can start. I think it depends on what kind of scale you're looking at. So if you're trying to average everything out to the whole nation, it's easy to look at some of these issues, especially around diversity, and say, well, on the average, it's not that big, right? So like when I showed this example of these alternative rate requests, they don't show up anywhere in the average. And yet when you get to the heterogeneity of it and you look at specific places, these seemingly small changes are in reality big changes for small groups of people. And so I think that's why we should care about equity as it relates to these programs, is because that's in part what it means. It means a group that is less represented and smaller in numbers is having worse outcomes. And so on that, maybe it's not a huge deal, but it means a lot to a group of people.
Aparna or Tong, do you have anything to add there?
For me, actually, what I find that's the economic magnitude is never really super small. I mean, the thing here is about the access too, right? When I talk about economic magnitude is for the people who already have the access. Now, if they don't have the access, that's a different question. I think somebody already mentioned this, and probably we should talk about it more, that our data set is limited. Our data set is only for the people who have participated. That's how the whole design is working. But other than that, if they have access to conservation conditional on that, it's more than 5%. I mean, the minimum effect on the economic development or the yield that I see, it's never like below 5%, 4%. And at the beginning, that the initial effect was much higher, and that probably has an issue with the expansion of the federal payment. Because at the beginning, first years were really like, we really want to change it. We really want to change everything. But then the distribution, special distribution has somehow like got decayed down. So, but in general, economic magnitude is pretty strong for me. But I also want to mention here that I'm only talking about the people who already have the access. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Tong?
for my study, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I carried out the survey in the 4 Midwest states, which, like kind of margins of the Corn Belt. So we found that in order to just increase the carbon program participation rate, so current is the price offered is about less than $30 per mg. So in order to increase that participation rate from the current less than 5% to maybe 50%, I think the price offered has to double in order to the farmers to make the participation decisions. Another factor is we found there is a lack of information. So it's not focused on the economic side. Sometimes is the lack of information on the carbon sequestration. They may actually deter farmers' participation decisions as well.
Great. Well, I haven't seen any other questions come in, so I will stop there, and I will just thank you all one more time for presenting. These were fantastic presentations and really interesting topics. So thank you all for submitting and sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
With that, I just want to say to everyone online, Thank you again for joining us today. Please join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time. We're going to have an industry panel discussing some of these issues at the intersection of ag policy, economics, and then diverse farms and farmers. Also, later in the day tomorrow, after the industry panel, we'll have 2 more research sessions. The first will focus on topics related to supply and demand. And then the second research session will focus on issues related to farm sizes, crop type, and producer behavior. So with that, we'll wrap up.